Living in Cedar Heights felt like the perfect decision, until that October morning. The sun had barely risen when loud knocking on my door woke me up. On the other side, an older man with gray hair and a stiff posture was holding an improvised list of fines. He introduced himself as Mr. Wilson, a self-proclaimed condo officer, demanding a parking fee for my bicycle that was on the balcony of my own apartment. "That's $50 for breaking the parking rules," he declared, handing me up a crumpled piece of paper. In that moment, I realized my peaceful life in the condominium was about to change drastically. What started as an argument over a bike on the balcony would soon turn into a battle for justice and common sense in our community. Little did Mr. Wilson know that his little display of authority was about to expose far more than he intended. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. I decided to handle the situation in the most civilized way possible and went over to the condo's leasing office. Jessica, the employee in charge, greeted me with a look mixing compassion and resignation. It wasn't the first time someone had come to complain about Mr. Wilson. "Unfortunately, we have a slight issue with your lease," Jessica explained as she leafed through a folder full of documents. "There's a clause about vehicles that can be interpreted pretty broadly." She pointed out a specific paragraph that mentioned parking regulations, but didn't exactly specify what types of vehicles were included. While we were discussing the possible interpretations, Jessica lowered her voice and confided that other residents had faced similar issues. Wilson had developed a special knack for finding loopholes in every line of the contract, turning simple rules into a maze of interpretations that suited his interests. "Technically, he doesn't have any official authority," she whispered, nervously looking over her shoulder. "But the HOA board has gotten used to accepting his complaints to avoid bigger conflicts." Jessica handed me a copy of the complete condominium regulations, suggesting I study it carefully. I left the office with more questions than answers. The document in my hand felt like a map to navigate turbulent waters, but something told me that Wilson wasn't just interpreting rules. He was creating his own little kingdom in Cedar Heights, and I had just become his newest target. During the following weeks, I tried to adapt my routine to avoid confrontations. I even started storing my bicycle inside the apartment, even if that meant less space in my living room. But Wilson wasn't satisfied. Now he was complaining about tire marks my bike left in the hallway when I carried it. So I decided to carry it in my arms, avoiding any contact with the floor. That lasted until Wilson put up a new rule about personal items in the hallways, even if it was just while moving through. Every solution I came up with, he invented a new restriction. The atmosphere in the condo became more stifling with each passing day. Wilson began taking photos of my balcony, claiming he was documenting irregularities. He even installed extra cameras aimed at my window, apparently for condominium security. I started running into him, by chance, every time I left or came home. One day, when I got back from work, I found a notice on my door saying that bicycles could only be stored in the area designated for vehicle parking. I tried arguing that this contradicted his previous rule of not leaving the bike on the balcony, but Wilson just smiled with satisfaction. "Rules evolve as the needs of the condo change," he declared, adjusting his clipboard as if it were a badge of authority. "If you're not happy, maybe you should look for somewhere else to live." The situation reached its peak when Wilson started handing out flyers to other residents, listing my so-called violations. The document included everything from excessive bicycle chain noise to disruption of the condo's visual harmony. I realized that no matter how hard I tried to follow the rules, Wilson would keep changing them. Every time I tried to adjust, he'd come up with even more absurd restrictions. It was like he thrived on making others bend over backwards to meet his ever-changing irrational demands. The silent war between us was about to enter a new phase, and I was done playing by the rules, especially when those rules changed at the whim of a condo tyrant. Everything changed one rainy Thursday. When I got home from work, my bicycle had just vanished. In its place, there was only a yellow tow sticker. Wilson had finally gotten what he wanted. Using his shady connections with a towing company, he managed to have my bike towed away, as if it were an abandoned vehicle. At that moment, something snapped inside me. This was no longer just about a bike. It was about dignity, about the right to live in peace in my own home. As I stared at that yellow sticker in my hand, I decided it was time to turn the tables. First, I went to the towing company. The employee told me that the removal order had come directly from the condo administrator, a title that Wilson had given himself. To get my bike back, I'd have to pay a fee of $150, plus the accumulated fines that Wilson had logged. During the release process, I noticed something odd. The removal authorization document had an official stamp from the condominium. How had Wilson managed to get that? Jessica had assured me he didn't have any official authority. On my way back, with my bike reclaimed, I started connecting the dots. Wilson couldn't have been acting alone. Someone on the board must have been validating his actions, either for convenience or for some other reason. I decided to change my approach. Instead of reacting to Wilson's provocations, I started watching him discreetly. I installed a legally permitted security camera inside my apartment, pointed at my balcony. If he could spy on me, I could document his actions too. I soon noticed a pattern in his rounds. He didn't inspect all apartments equally. Some residents seemed completely immune to his inspections, while others were his constant targets. I began noting down times, dates, and suspicious behavior. One night, while walking around the condo, I caught Wilson removing an unauthorized surveillance camera he had installed himself, after a resident threatened to call the police. I recorded it all with my phone. On another occasion, I saw him tearing up a formal complaint that a resident had left in the suggestion box. The turning point came when I witnessed an argument between Wilson and an elderly lady on the third floor. He was demanding a special maintenance fee that wasn't listed in any official document. The poor lady, frightened of reprisals, handed over the money with trembling hands. That scene was the last straw. It wasn't just about my bike or arbitrary rules anymore. It was about abuse of power and extortion. Wilson had built a system of intimidation so effective that people preferred to pay up and keep quiet rather than stand up to him. I realized I had to act, not just for myself, but for everyone suffering in silence. It was time to transform my outrage into concrete action. With mounting evidence, I decided it was time to dig deeper and uncover just how far Wilson's web of manipulation extended. I spent the next few weeks investigating every detail of the condominium's regulations. I discovered that the official document was only 15 pages long, while Wilson distributed an updated version stretching 47 pages, filled with rules he'd invented himself. At the municipal library, I researched state legislation regarding condominiums and homeowner associations. Wilson's practices violated at least a dozen different regulations. His unauthorized cameras breached privacy laws, and his informal charges could be classified as extortion. In a forgotten folder at the leasing office, I found archived complaints against Wilson dating back 3 years. Jessica, noticing my genuine interest in resolving the situation, began to help me discreetly. She revealed that Wilson kept a personal file with residents' information, something explicitly forbidden by the regulations. "He even has a file on you," Jessica whispered during our last meeting. "Actually, he has one on anyone who's ever confronted him." She also confirmed my suspicions about the official stamp. Wilson had borrowed it without permission during a board meeting. Through cautious conversations with maintenance staff, I found out that Wilson pressured them to report on residents' activities. One of them, Pedro, told me he was forced to take pictures of apartments during routine maintenance. The most shocking discovery came when I found records of suspicious bank deposits. The fees and fines Wilson collected weren't going to the condo's coffers. They were being deposited into a personal account disguised as the Cedar Heights Improvement Fund. Elizabeth, a board member, secretly approached me after noticing me investigating. "Wilson has something on every board member," she admitted. "Minor infractions, recorded conversations, compromising photos. That's why no one dares question him." By reviewing the footage from the cameras he had installed, I discovered that some were streaming directly to his personal computer. Others even recorded audio of hallway conversations, a serious violation of residents' privacy. In his makeshift control room in the garage, which he called his security office, Wilson kept monitors showing live images from various areas of the condominium. I managed to discreetly photograph this illegal setup during a routine inspection. The most ironic part was that Wilson's own apartment violated several of the condo rules. His structural modifications were never approved, and he occupied 2 parking spots without authorization. His own cameras even recorded him breaking the same rules he imposed on everyone else. Each discovery revealed further layers of the control system Wilson had built. He wasn't just an intrusive neighbor. He was a manipulator who had turned Cedar Heights into his personal kingdom through intimidation and blackmail. With all this evidence in hand, I began organizing a detailed dossier. Photographs, documents, recorded testimonies, financial records. Everything was carefully cataloged and backed up. If Wilson ever found out what I was doing, he'd surely try to destroy the proof. It was time to move to the next phase, finding other residents willing to speak up. I had the evidence, but I needed voices to amplify the truth about Wilson's reign of terror over Cedar Heights. I organized a secret meeting at the cafe across the street. One by one, the residents began to arrive, each with their own story of abuse and intimidation. Sarah, a teacher from the 4th floor, revealed that Wilson threatened to post her classes online during the pandemic as illegal commercial activity. Marcus from Block B admitted that he paid a monthly silence fee to keep his little dog out of Wilson's crosshairs. During the meeting, over 20 residents shared similar experiences. Some brought documents, others recordings. A resistance network was forming. We even created an encrypted messaging group to share information safely. But Wilson soon noticed something was different. People no longer kept their heads down when he passed by. He began ramping up his threats, sending increasingly aggressive notifications. He installed more cameras and intensified his rounds. One morning, I found my bicycle tire flat. The next day, Sarah had her mailbox vandalized. Marcus received an anonymous threat about his dog. Wilson was striking back, but his desperate actions only strengthened our resolve. We decided to act. With Elizabeth from the board's help, we managed to call an extraordinary assembly. Wilson tried to stop it, claiming irregular procedures, but the number of signatures was too many to ignore. On the night of the assembly, the community hall was packed. Wilson arrived with his usual clipboard, a confident smile on his face. He probably thought it would be another meeting where his intimidation would prevail. I methodically presented the evidence. I projected photos of the illegal cameras, showed the suspicious financial records, and played recordings of his threats. With each new revelation, his smile faded. When I presented the document proving he had forged the official stamp, Wilson abruptly stood up. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted, pointing his finger at everyone. "You have no idea what I've done for this condominium. Without me, this place would be chaos." That's when Maria, a 78-year-old woman whom everyone respected, slowly stood up. "The only chaos here, Mr. Wilson, is what you created. I've lived here for 15 years, and we've never had peace since you arrived." The silence that followed was deafening. Wilson looked around, searching for allies, but all he found were determined gazes from people who were no longer afraid. His final words before leaving were a vague threat about lawsuits. The assembly voted unanimously for his removal from any position of power within the condominium. With Elizabeth now free of his threats, she proposed a complete audit of the accounts and a review of the security system. As people celebrated, I realized our victory went far beyond toppling a local tyrant. We'd reclaimed not just our condominium, but our dignity. Cedar Heights would no longer be a place of fear and intimidation. Wilson still lives here, though he's rarely seen. Sometimes I catch him in the elevator, his clipboard replaced by a bitter look of defeat. My bicycle remains proudly on the balcony, a small symbol of a much larger battle for justice. 6 months have passed since Wilson's downfall. Cedar Heights has transformed into a completely different place. The new board, led by Elizabeth, implemented significant changes. The invasive cameras were removed, replaced by a professional, transparent security system. The regulations went back to their original 15 pages, with clear and fair rules. But the most notable change was in the community's spirit. Neighbors who barely knew each other started organizing events together. The party hall, once practically abandoned because of Wilson's absurd restrictions, now hosts regular meetups. Sarah started a book club, Marcus hosts cinema sessions for the kids, and even Maria teaches gardening classes in the small community garden we created. Wilson, however, didn't disappear completely. In the first few months, he tried suing several residents, including me, for defamation and harassment. His lawsuits were dismissed when we presented evidence of his own irregularities. The threat of public exposure made him back off. Still, occasionally remnants of his influence linger. Some people are hesitant to use the shared spaces, as if they expect Wilson to show up with his clipboard. Others take a while to get used to the idea that they can actually decorate their balconies or have plants without fear of violations. One day, I ran into Wilson at the local supermarket. He looked different. Without that air of authority, he seemed smaller, older. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away and continued on his way. For a moment, I felt a twinge of compassion. What kind of person spends so much time and energy trying to control and intimidate others? At the last condominium meeting, we discussed creating a code of ethics to prevent future abuses of power. Jessica, now the official manager of the leasing office, suggested a rotation system for administrative roles to avoid a concentration of power. The most surprising part was when some veteran residents revealed that similar situations had happened even before Wilson. Cedar Heights seemed to attract people with controlling tendencies. "Maybe it's just something about living up high," Marcus joked. "Some folks confuse a great view with absolute power." My bicycle remains my daily ride, and now there are 5 more in the bike storage we set up. Wilson still lives on the third floor, but he rarely leaves his apartment. Sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of his silhouette at the window, watching the condominium move on without his rule. The experience taught us a lot about power, community, and courage. We learned that fear only has the control we allow it to have, and that a united community is stronger than any tyrant. And sometimes, it only takes a little spark, or in my case, a bicycle, to ignite a necessary revolution. Cedar Heights is now known in the neighborhood as an example of democratic management and an active community. We often get visits from residents of other condos, curious about how we managed to bring about such a transformation. The answer is always the same. It wasn't one person who changed Cedar Heights. It was an entire community that decided to reclaim its voice. Today, on the first anniversary of the events that transformed Cedar Heights, I reflect on how a simple dispute over a bicycle triggered such deep changes. Our story has become a sort of local urban legend, shared at meetings and other condos as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. Wilson still lives here, though he's more like a ghost from a bygone era. Last week, surprisingly, he appeared at one of the community meetings. He sat quietly in the back, just watching. Some of the newer residents didn't even know who he was. At the end of the meeting, he approached Elizabeth and, for the first time, apologized. It wasn't a dramatic moment of redemption, just a few murmured words about excesses and bad decisions. But for those who lived under his regime, it was a significant acknowledgement. Elizabeth accepted the apology graciously, suggesting that he could participate in community activities if he wished. The bike storage is now always full, especially after we rolled out a bike-sharing program for the residents. Ironic enough, last week I saw Wilson watching the new system with interest. Maybe someday he'll even decide to take a ride. Cedar Heights became proof of how a community can transform when people unite against injustice. But we also constantly remind ourselves to stay vigilant. As Maria says, freedom is like a garden. It needs daily care. My bicycle still hangs on the balcony, now accompanied by plant pots and a little reading chair. Sometimes, when I ride home at the end of the day, I look at the building and see all the decorated balconies, each one reflecting its owner's personality. There's no more forced uniformity, just the natural harmony of a diverse, lively community. The story of Cedar Heights isn't over. It continues to evolve with every new resident, every meeting, every small decision made together. Now we know that true power isn't about controlling others, but about creating a space where everyone can thrive freely. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. The epilogue of this story came unexpectedly. One Sunday morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Wilson. At first, I hesitated to open it, but my curiosity got the best of me. I took a long time to understand, the letter began, that my obsessive control over Cedar Heights was a way of compensating for my own feelings of powerlessness. I spent years believing I was protecting order, when in reality I was just feeding my own demons. Wilson revealed that he had started therapy a few months after being ousted. His therapist helped him see that his controlling behavior had roots in traumatic experiences from his childhood. It wasn't an excuse, he stressed. It was just an explanation he was only beginning to comprehend. The most surprising part came at the end of the letter. Wilson was moving out. Not out of bitterness or resentment, but because he recognized he needed a fresh start. Cedar Heights became a better place without my interference, he wrote. And that's something I never thought I'd admit. During the week of his move, something extraordinary happened. Several residents, even some he had pursued most aggressively, offered help with the boxes and the move. Wilson seemed taken aback by the kindness, perhaps for the first time understanding what community truly meant. On his last day, before leaving, Wilson stopped by the bike storage. He observed for a moment the lined-up bicycles, including mine, and smiled slightly. "You know," he said to me, as I happened to be nearby, "sometimes you have to lose control to find your humanity." Cedar Heights continues to evolve. Wilson's apartment was purchased by a young couple with 2 small children. Their laughter now echoes through the halls that once were filled with tense silence. Our story with Wilson became more than a tale of villains and heroes. It turned into a lesson about redemption and the human capacity to change. The bike that started it all is still with me, albeit a bit more worn by time. It remains as a symbol not only of resistance, but also of transformation, of both a community and an individual who finally found peace by letting go of control. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this.